good way to finish the week, I have to say, is to have Jaqui Lane ringing in from Sydney, our Australian correspondent, because we've been talking about what we're going to give her, haven't we, in terms of wine and Central Otago Pinot Noir this morning. And she joins us now. Jaqui, I'm glad you didn't hear our conversation, but we are sending you the Pinot Noir from Central Otago. Our listeners this morning and we're having a bit of a conversation about which is the best value Central Otago Pinot Noir. Do you like any other grape variety, by the way?
Look, I like most wines, but I'm as you well know.
You're a girl after my own heart.
Oh, totally. But but the Pinot Noir and a good Pinot Grigio are my favourite goes to at the moment.
Okay, Pinot Grigio. Yeah, that's something that's very Australian, isn't it, really? Originally comes from Italy. But we don't see a lot of Pinot Grigio in New Zealand. Is it a fashionable wine? It's a bit drier, isn't it, than a Pinot Gris?
Yeah, it's become more fashionable here. And interestingly, I think that New Zealand was always pretty well known here for its Sauv Blanc and stuff like that, but certainly the competition is heating up with a Pinot Gris and a Pinot Grigio here in Australia.
Yes, because everybody used to say Australia can't make white wines. You're saying that's not true?
Yeah, it's changing.
It needed to, though, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I was actually, just before we get on to what's happened in Australia, I was reading a piece, I think, in the Sydney Morning Herald. It might have even been in the ABC, about Australia's going through a crisis of confidence in the wine industry to do with Shiraz. What's the background to that?
Oh, gosh, I'm not sure. I'll have to go and research that. I'm sure I'll have to take it.
Oh, well, I'll explain. They're essentially saying that Shiraz has sort of done its time. It was always the big Aussie red and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that Shiraz makers are now saying that it's not as popular either domestically or internationally as well, and that they're struggling to work out where to go to next with a grape that is so definitively Australian. Yeah,
and that's an interesting thing. So in my corporate history life writing, I actually wrote a history of Peter Lehmann wines. And had the great pleasure. It was one of the best projects I ever had to do because, of course, I had to go down to the Barossa and research the vineyard and taste their wines, didn't I? The Barossa in the 80s and 90s and even 2000, and today still is the heart of that big, beefy Shiraz. Look, I think all sorts of fashion, that big, heavy reds are kind of slightly going out of fashion. It used to be my go-to wine, and I've kind of migrated to a Pinot Noir. So maybe I'm part of that trend that just of a different style of wine. So I still like a Shiraz, but you asked me what my preference was, and I went out and, it's Pinot Noir. So I think that certainly in my history when I did Peter Lehmann wines, they kind of created and built out that big, heavy, Shiraz from the Barossa, and maybe times have changed. And you have now more people drinking different wines, and people are choosing to go with different, I guess, flavours.
One of the things that, I'm of an age where I'd like to think that I'm settled in my wine. I'm not actually. I do shift around, Jack, just like you. But is Prosecco. That's something that's come into New Zealand the last probably 4 or 5 years, become quite fashionable. It's a low alcohol, sparkling, sweet wine. Is it the same in Australia? Is that popular amongst what sort of mostly young girls, really, young women?
Yeah, very much so here, and it's a trendy young person's drink. Although I think lots of people kind of drink it, and it's just they've done a great job of marketing it. So I think that's again just a whole thing around marketing and positioning, and good old-fashioned target marketing, and away you go. And Australia's hot and humid and wet, and having a nice bubbly light wine is probably a lot smarter for a lot of people.
Well, just on that, I'm glad you've mentioned that, because we're just going through a bit of a, there's a storm front coming over New Zealand. I mean, they come over all the time. But next week, we've got hot weather that we've been told by our broadcasters is going to be coming to New Zealand from Waitangi Day, actually, onwards next week, as a result of a heat wave that Australia is currently underway. Climate change. Is it something that is true? Because, I mean, Australia's always been hot in summer. I mean, we all know that. But is it got worse, got better? Has it got different? What are the effects of climate change on Australia and Australians that you've observed? Jack?
Okay, well, there you go, becoming a climate scientist now. So I've certainly observed, over the 30-plus years that I've lived in Sydney, from a Sydney point of view, we used to have hot summers, and it used to get really humid in February. And so I used to actually travel in February because I hated the humidity. Now, for the last 4 or 5 years, it gets hot around December and humid from December through till about March. So, and with my fuzzy curly hair, I look like I've been plugged into a light socket most of the time. So I've certainly noticed the heat in Sydney has probably been the same, but the humidity profile has changed substantially in the last 5 or 6 years. We get more floods more often, more major flooding more often. I don't have scientific proof for that, but these 1 in 100 year floods are happening every 2 or 3 years, in various parts of the country. The fires are more intense and bigger. So I think everything in the last 30 years has become more frequent and more significant in terms of the damage and the size of them.
Isn't that ironic? So you've got more wet, you've got more rain, and you talked about floods and things like that, but the intensity of your forest fires has got heavier. Is it, that seems almost contradictory, doesn't it?
No. Well, it does, but there's a reason for that. So if it's wetter, there's more growth in the bush, brush and bush and trees. And if you don't have the capacity to do fire hazard reductions, because it's windier, so the opportunity to do fire hazard reduction is really reduced. Over time, you have more fuel for more fires. So whilst it may seem odd that it's wetter and humider, and you get these fires, they're actually interrelated.
Our weather is getting increasingly influenced by Australian weather too. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, Jack, as you're probably aware, we had our weather tinged each night by a pink glow as a result of the Sydney bushfires. Is it bushfire season again coming up? Is it, or are you in it now?
Well, we're in it now, but it hasn't been so bad this year because we had some fires early on in summer, like late November, early December, but because it's been so wet, we haven't had so many fires. So that might be good for this year, but then next year it might be because there's way more growth. It may be that the fire season's worse. So it's a bit schizophrenic, but hey, we're living in a land of flood and fire, and it's getting more intense and more regular.
Okay, talking about fire, it seems that ABC is in the midst of a conflagration all of its own at the moment. They terminated, or at least sacked, a journalist by the name of Antoinette Lattouf. Now, for those of us in New Zealand, that doesn't mean anything, but what seems is that ABC, which is the equivalent, I suppose, of Radio New Zealand, is it, in Australia?
Yeah.
They are almost in some form of armed insurrection between management and staff over the sacking. Can you explain it to us?
Oh, look, this whole thing around what's going on in Gaza at the moment. And so you have people who are pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, and never the twain shall meet, which is understandable. I think Antoinette was contracted to work for 5 days to fill in for somebody. And after 3 days, she was sacked from that. So Antoinette is of Lebanese heritage, so she made some comments that technically outraged some people and raised questions over the independence of the ABC, because the ABC's big thing is it has to be independent, not push one thing or the other. So it's really become a very difficult thing in Australia over this whole issue around being a community that has to deal with two very different views about what's happening there, and our national broadcaster needs to be independent.
Yeah, I understand that. Well, I wish our national broadcaster was independent in this country, but it's not. Gosh, you wouldn't get sacked. You'd get probably promoted for having a strong left view in the Radio New Zealand, particularly you do at TVNZ News. But, Jaqui, can I just ask, in this particular case, though, the ABC union members who make up, I guess, the majority of staff there, they've demanded that she is returned to work. The ABC board, which is led by Ita Buttrose, who I think she was the editor of the Australian Woman's Weekly, wasn't she? Is that where she made her name?
She was decades ago.
Yeah. But she's a businesswoman in her own right. She is also digging her toes, saying, no, we fired her because, it's a very interesting philosophical view, she made her comments on social media, as you say, whilst she was being employed, but she didn't make it on the program that she was actually employed to host. She got sacked for her comments on social media because, as you say, they demonstrate a particular bias to one side or the other in that intractable conflict in the Middle East. And so the ABC journalists got upset, what? That she got sacked for having that view, or that she got sacked for having a view at all when she's meant to be politically neutral?
She got sacked for having a view.
Right. Okay.
As far as I understand it. And that view, or a view, was on her social media, not while she was performing her job at the ABC.
From here, I mean, I know from here and from bitter personal experience, which I won't recount today, but I might a little bit later on. But that is that this Gaza Israel thing, Hamas Israel thing, war, it's drawing in, isn't it? It's become part of the culture wars in the West. And so I'm even finding, and believe it or not, my position of being an elected Otago regional councillor down in deepest, darkest Dunedin, it's drawing us in as well. Is that true in Australia too, where people are being forced to take sides on this issue? Because it seems almost every day I look at Australian media, and Gaza and Israel is prominent in the coverage, and the responses to Australia's response or not is a live issue.
It's a very live issue. Pretty much every weekend for the past 8-9 weeks, there have been pro-Palestinian protests in Hyde Park in Sydney, and in Melbourne and some other states less frequently. There are pro-Israeli protests and marches, and 99% of them are respectful, and so people are out there absolutely. Both sides are advocating for their cause and their people, and it is a daily topic of conversation between my friends and I in the newspapers. It's very present here because of the large communities we have representing both those groups.